So, and then a couple of you are hoping that we end on a more positive tone this afternoon. So, and I know there's really very little that we can do to change what might be happening in the world, but we certainly can, I think, embrace this call and I really believe that it is a call, that we can embrace this call to express hope in a society that lives in despair. And that is the third of the tasks of prophetic communities that Walter Brueggemann writes about. And I want to note here, too, there's a couple things I want to note, that these are tasks for communities. These are not necessarily tasks for us as individuals. We can never accomplish this kind of prophetic work as individuals. We can only really be effective in terms of prophetic presence in relationship with others. And for us, that is in the community. I call it our communities of belonging, where we grew up in our vocation. And then we belong to successive communities beyond that, and we belong to one another, and we belong to the church and to the world. And so as we are, each of us is unique individual, but we will never be the prophetic presence that we're called to be as individuals. We can only be that together with one another in community. And I often think about, there's a sister in my community who I would say frequently does not fail to suggest that she is a prophet among us. And I just get really nervous when I think that somebody is perceiving, like when somebody says, I am a prophet, I just want to run. Because it's really not that we are not prophets as individuals. We do not live a prophetic life as an individual. And so what I really want to unpack during this conversation this afternoon is the prophetic dimension of the vocation that we're living, this prophetic dimension of consecrated life. And I want to do that in relationship to Walter Brueggemann's call to be prophetic communities. So, and we cannot, the despair that we're seeing, we're seeing it. I think we're seeing it more and more. We're seeing it everywhere. We're so exposed to the despair, and it really can render us paralyzed. There's times I simply cannot look at the news one more time. Because it's so despairing. And I know that I can have no impact as an individual. But my hope lies in I deeply belong to others, and they belong to me, and we have a common desire to see something different in this world. So I want to recall for us how Walter Brueggemann thinks about and writes about, and we lost Walter Brueggemann, as you know, earlier this year. What a tremendous loss. Who's an amazing Hebrew scripture scholar. And I think so much of how we see the scriptures today is really indebted. We're just so indebted to him. But he speaks about this task of prophetic ministry. And when he's talking about prophetic ministry, he's not necessarily meaning an active job. That's not what he's meaning. That's not what he's suggesting. He is suggesting that the very presence is a ministry. So the task of prophetic presence is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness, a perception of the world, a worldview that's alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture and worldview around us. So this work of being a prophetic presence, prophetic communities, it's the work, it's the positioning of being countercultural. Now, we have used that term countercultural for decades relative to religious life and consecrated life, that we counter the culture. We are not in opposition to the culture, but we present counter values to what we see in the culture. And I want to note here where the way Walter Brueggemann writes about this, about the culture and the counterculture, is that he speaks about the forces of empire. That's really when he unpacks the scripture and the prophetic, and when he unpacks the prophets, it's their indictment of the forces of empire. And we're going to look and unpack that. And he juxtaposes it with the hospitality of neighborhood. So the counter witness, the counter culture, and that counter witness does not belong just to consecrated life. It belongs to every community that is called to be prophetic. And it's to respond to the forces of empire with the hospitality of neighborhood. So we're going to look at we're going to kind of unpack both of those. And then what I want to do is then talk about who are we as men and women religious, living in communities and being communities of hope and prophetic witness. So when he speaks about the forces of empire, and think about the world that we are seeing today. Just think about the world that we're seeing. These forces of empire, they're recognizable because they use power and force. And these are kind of, if you think about they're the invisible systems that our whole society is structured on. And when our whole society is structured and organized around power and force, where are we seeing that? Think about where we're seeing that in the world today. That in the empire, the resources serve the powerful. And so what we're seeing in terms of global wealth, what we're seeing certainly in my country, I don't know about your country, the widening gap between those who have the wealth, the accumulation, the massive accumulation at the top, and this myth, the absolute myth of trickle-down economics, where whoever thought that if we give the people who have the most wealth, if we give them the more wealth, that is going to be an inspiration to divest of their wealth so that others can have some wealth. Like how did we ever adopt that? So what we see in forces of it, but when we talk about that system, they'll say, well, we can't change that. That's just how the way the world is. So that's typically the answer when you try to confront the forces of empire. So in an empire, the public life is a monologue. There's no dialogue. And the monologue usually it really comes from those who will control the narrative. And so think about think about what we're seeing in terms of kind of any sort of like public narrative right now. Who is controlling the narrative? Follow the money, and you'll find the narrative. And in the empire, the information is weaponized, and it's politicized, and it's twisted, and so Think about, I mean, I'm just seeing these images of my own news, as I go through every one of these. The way the information is controlled, it's misinformation, it's disinformation. In the empire, religion is conflated with patriotism and nationalism. So recall this morning when we talked about the rise in white Christian nationalism. That is not a religious movement. That's a political movement that disguises itself as a religious movement and conflates patriotism and nationalism. And in the empire, the ideology that really functions is the ideology of scarcity and greed and fear and violence. And so when you think about, what happens in a society where the wealth is concentrated at the top, and that means all the resources are concentrated, and there are few resources for the many, for the majority. So the narrative becomes a scarcity narrative, when in reality there is enough. It is simply not distributed. So I remember when COVID broke out, and I don't know what happened here, but in my country, there was the hoarding of toilet paper. Did you have that? The hoarding of toilet paper? Okay, so somebody, and I thought, wow, like this person had such a gift for forecasting, and he used it for such bizarre evil. So there was a very early on in the pandemic, there was a young man, I think 2 young men in Kentucky, who kind of forecasted and realized that this is going to be bad. And literally, they went around to all the stores in Kentucky and bought out toilet paper. And then they hoarded it, and they sold it at astronomical prices. But the narrative was that there's no toilet paper. There is toilet paper. It's simply not distributed. The narrative is that there is in the empire is that there's not enough. There is enough. It's simply not made available. So when we think about, and again, this is it's kind of stripping away the illusion. When you see all of this connected, and you say, "Oh my gosh, like this is all connected." So that's the forces of empire that the biblical prophets were constantly challenging. So when you go back into the biblical prophets, they're really they're naming these things. They're naming the abuse of power. They're naming the hoarding of resources. They're naming the lack of public engagement. And the counter to that, the counter to the forces of empire, is this beautiful essence of the hospitality of neighborhood. So you take every one of those facets of empire and ask, what is the opposite? What would it look like if we were actually creating neighborhoods, or a neighborhood, if we saw our globe as a neighborhood, we saw our countries as neighborhood, we saw our cities as neighborhood? What would happen if we actually saw our neighborhoods as neighborhood? And so neighborhood is not about the use or abuse of power. It's really about neighborliness. It's about relationship and entering in deeply into relationship. Resources serve the common good in a neighborhood. I grew up, I grew up thinking that being Italian, like being Catholic, also meant you were Italian, because everybody in my neighborhood was Catholic and Italian. And so I grew up in this consciousness of there's always food. You can go to anybody's house and there's going to be food. And that we all have the same food on Christmas Eve. We're all going to do the seven fishes. Imagine my surprise when I went to high school and discovered that there actually were like Irish Catholics and Polish Catholics. I'm like, wow, but to imagine but growing up in a neighborhood and in Pittsburgh where I grew up, it was heavily settled by European migration. And so our neighborhoods are actually, they are the conclaves of the migrants. So I was in the Italian neighborhood, then there was an Irish neighborhood, so all of that, but everything was for everybody. It didn't matter. I could walk into somebody's house and eat off their table and their stove. They could come into my house and be assured of food. And when something tragic happened, we all were one. So I know you know this. And so in the hospitality of neighborhood, the public life, there's a dialogue. There's difference. You can hold differences in a healthy community. In the empire, you cannot hold differences. Differences are managed. They're squelched. But in the neighborhood, you can be different. And the measure of the relationship between religion in the neighborhood is not conflating it with a political power, but it's simply living the gospel. And I think this is one reason why our political parties, I don't know about yours, but certainly mine in the US, neither the Republican or Democratic Party, no matter where we are politically, neither party expresses the fullness of the gospel. Neither party. And so this work of being neighborly is to really elevate the values of the gospel beyond political party and beyond the partisanship. And in the neighborhood, it's not a scarcity mentality, it's an abundance mentality. There is enough. Because there's enough because people share. There's enough because people trust. There's enough because people reconcile. There's enough because we forgive. So you can see these polar opposites and these tensions that are vivid in the stories of the Hebrew Scriptures, and that is really where the prophets, where we hear the call of the prophets. And then we have to ask ourselves, what does the call of the prophets 5,000, 4,000, 3,000 years ago have to do with us? And what it has to do with us is that consecrated life in the church and the world is a prophetic presence. I myself and you yourself are not prophetic, but together we are a prophetic presence in the world. So religious life as a prophetic presence, so what a prophet does, what prophecy does, what prophetic ministry does, it essentially illumines the way things are in the reign of God. It points to the reign of God. And religious life and consecrated life as a prophetic presence does just that. It illumines the way things are, the way we believe things are in the reign of God, where everybody has enough, everybody belongs, everybody is loved, and everybody is free. That is the essence of the core of the vows that we take. That everybody is loved, everybody belongs, everybody is free, and everybody has what they need. So the way we live our communal life is to be that kind of image to ourselves, to one another, and to the world. And a prophetic presence, it's a critique of our cultural values. So you remember where Brueggemann is saying, the prophetic presence offers an alternate consciousness and alternate values. And so this vowed life that we have, this consecrated life that we have and that we live together in community, it is intended to to critique cultural values. It is not intended to be critical. There's a difference. But to stand as a critique to everything that would say, you don't belong, somebody isn't free, you shouldn't have what you need. This is the essence of the prophetic presence. And the cultural values that we mainly critique are these basic human drives for power, which is how we experience authority, money, which is how we manage our households, that's what economy does, and sexuality, which is the power to create. And so when you think about, and we see this, I want to go back, we think about the structures that we've let go of, that we've moved on from during the renewal and beyond. But when you think about the structures of religious life, where some in this room entered a very structured life, is that right? So the structures were intended to ensure in some way, or to address in some way these three drives. So the economy of religious life is an alternate economy. To hold all things in common, who does that? To make decisions in relationship with others, who does that? To forego to be the exclusive object of somebody's affection, and to forego that, to hold somebody exclusively as the object of our affection, this is what is counter. It's not better than, it's counter to. To say that there is a way things are in the reign of God that looks like this hospitality of neighborhood does not look like the forces of empire. We have alternative priorities. The priorities of the common good. And all through history, and I say this humbly, and I say this acknowledging that historically, religious life in the church has also done great harm in civil society through all sorts of persecutions, through the Crusades. I say that, I acknowledge that. And at the same time, we cannot miss the fact or not acknowledge that historically, consecrated life, men and women, religious communities have humanized society throughout the centuries. We have humanized society. It was the religious houses, the abbeys, the monasteries that preserved language, the arts, that were the locus of agriculture. All of those things that we have come to know as the humanities that humanize society. And so I believe the question for us today is not what ministry should we be doing. We were unpacking that earlier, but what is needed to humanize society? It's not more schools. It's not institutions. But a society that cannot tell the truth, and a society that cannot grieve is in need of so much healing. It's in need of so much vulnerability, the expression of our vulnerability. And so this is connected to, Meg, to what you asked earlier, like who are we now? And how do we prepare for who we will be as we're small? And it begs the question of what is possible now? Who are we together as a prophetic presence now because we're smaller, not despite our smallness? But what is possible now? And I suggest that a couple things are possible, is to really transform this sense of what it means to be eldering. I heard, who was I speaking to this morning about saging? Love that. Saging, not aging. But what does elderhood look like in a society that prioritizes youth? And do we have anything that we can say to that? Do we have any wisdom, any space that we can create for that? What does it look? Earlier this morning, I'm sorry, I won't remember your name, but you spoke about the sisters, that your sisters were out there at the demonstrations. Our presence matters. It just matters. When we show up, something happens. When we show up in advocacy, which doesn't mean to offer our advocacy doesn't depend on how old we are, how young we are, how many we are. It's our corporate voice, it's our public voice. And so this sense of what does our vowed life look like? What can it look like? And what can it offer our culture today that can be humanizing? What are the ways that we might find to create space for others to experience community? To offer a gesture of open space, to offer a gesture of relationship. I mean, there's so many ways that you can think about when we think about presence, what our presence is and could mean. It moves us off of what activity am I going to do? And it has the potential to create a deeper meaning for our presence. And that has the potential, I believe that has the potential to not only offer hope to the world, but to really also create these sparks of hope within ourselves and in our community. That I was speaking with a sister in another community, and she is about, I think she's about 99 years old. Yeah. And we were talking, and I said to her, I was at her mother house, and we were walking down a hallway, we met, and I said, oh, so where are you going? And she said, I'm going to sit at the entrance. And I said, oh, what's at the entrance? And she said, I don't know. But whoever comes, I want to welcome them. So I saw her later the day, and I said, how was your time at the entrance? And she said, oh, I know I was meant to be there. I said, well, what happened? And she said, a mother came with her child, and they had no food. And so I took them in, and I gave them a glass of water. And then I found out who had the food in our house. And I sent them home with food. I mean, that seems so small. But you can repeat that over and over and over again So for that mother and that child, they were fed today, that day. They would not be fed otherwise. So 99 years old, she's still up being present. I'm just going to go to the entrance. Has no idea what will happen that day. So, so there's, you could have a lot of conversation about a lot of things about this kind of prophetic presence as communities. But what I'm really kind of wondering about is, as you consider your own community and religious life in Australia at this time, what do you find? What are you thinking about? What are the ways that for you, it could be possible for you to be a prophetic witness at this time in your community's life, in your own life, differently than you could be in the past? And I keep juxtaposing this question, this differently than in the past, so that we can be free from judging ourselves in the present using a criteria from the past. So what are you freed for now? What kind of prophetic life are you freed for now that you were not freed for in the past?